What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Well, hello, my friends. I am Henricuto, your host and narrator, and thank you so much for joining us for another week of thrills and chills and something else that rhymes. Hopefully not ills, though. Please practice your social distancing, wash your hands. I hope everybody is well that is listening. I'm doing okay. Being home alone so much is getting to me here and there, but this week's story kind of inspired me a little bit because you see, it's written by our producer Dan Wilder, and it is about talking. And talking is something that I know very well. I'm known for never shutting up. But lately, doing podcasts has been a little bit harder because I don't have anything to talk about. I go from the couch to the refrigerator, I pet the dog, then I pet the other dog. I start to worry and get really insecure before I record that I have nothing to talk about. So what if you were a person, like in tonight's story, who can't speak at all? But what if you were given the ability to speak, but that ability came with a caveat, which is you didn't get to choose what you said? What if you got to say things that no other person would ever say? How would you take that gift? Would that be a gift? Or would it be a curse? Well, I say we find out by listening to tonight's story. The God Tongue by Dan Wilder. Born without a tongue to grant him the power of speech, Ezra had long been the target of derision by his peers. So much so that when his beloved mother had breathed her last, he abandoned the home in which he was raised and took to the hills and forests that bordered the microcosm of the world's backwoods notions that was the town of Jaden's Cross. Once there, Ezra built himself a modest cabin financed with his meager inheritance, where he could find solace away from the chorus of mocking voices. Living off the land, Ezra killed only that which he could consume, and his growling stomach, coupled with his barren icebox, had told him it was high time to venture out into the crisp autumnal evening. After long, fruitless hours, Ezra had seen nary a hint of prey, and though the moon hung swollen in the sky, a mist had begun to encroach upon the landscape of stoic pines that pointed like accusing fingers at the heavens. Ezra exhaled wearily and sat down at the base of the nearest pine. The miasma played seductively at his neck and chin, causing his skin to turn to gooseflesh as the fog was a great deal cooler than the air that surrounded it. Ezra closed his eyes for a moment and let the symphony of the forest fill his ears. And, for minutes, it did just that, until his placid repose was shattered by the sound of a twig breaking that echoed through the cool air like the report of a shotgun being discharged. Ezra's eyes snapped open, and, as his gaze furtively darted to and fro, he spied majestic antlers rising from the fog. In a fluid motion he rose to his feet and brought the sight of his Remington rifle to bear on the dark shape that stood just below the mist. Ezra squeezed the trigger, sending fire and thunder forth into the night, and as soon as they appeared, the antlers fell. He bolted forward through the swirling gray, which seemed to recoil from his advancing form as if fearful of his presence to his quarry. As he approached, the fog had now parted and refused to trespass where the beast lay. And while Ezra was unable to give voice to his shock, his slack jaw and bulging eyes more than conveyed his emotions. For while he expected to find a stag, he instead found a caricature of a man, albeit a man with antlers. Ezra kneeled and rolled the creature on its back. Its lifeless eyes were large, dark, and set wide upon a face covered in coarse fur. It wore little in the way of clothing, just a simple robe from which extended limbs that resembled a dog's leg, that ended in long, tapered fingers tipped with crimson nails. It was in one such appendage that the creature clutched what at first appeared to Ezra to be a smooth ebony stone. He reached for the object and found it malleable and warm. More flesh than mineral. As he turned the artifact over and over in his palm, the mist began to slowly creep back, and with it came the inhuman wailing. Ezra panicked as the mist around him produced its litany of grief, which resulted in a mad flight through the dense pines. As he ran, Ezra could feel the miasma strike his legs as it began to solidify into long, lashing tendrils. As if that wasn't disconcerting enough, the wailing had now transformed into protracted screams of pure rage. Onward he flew, tripping and struggling as the fog continued its battery. Finally, he saw the familiar outline of his cabin in the clearing just beyond the forest. He threw his weight against the unlocked front door and exploded into his domain. In an instant, he slammed shut the door, threw the bolt into place, and collapsed to the floor in a crumpled mass of pure exhaustion. He sat for minutes as hot tears ran down his cheeks, and his heart beat so fast and hard that at any other time he would have been sure he was having a heart attack. Indeed, his hammering pulse was all he could hear, and it was that fact that made him realize that whatever outre abominations he had left behind in the woods, they had decided not to stray from that realm. Finally, he gained control of his faculties, moving his hands to his face to rub the last vestiges of tears from his eyes. Ezra realized he still clutched that preternatural stone, and where once it was merely matte black, now it glowed a brilliant gold from 1,000 hairline cracks that crossed its surface like arteries no wider than a human hair. Ezra was entranced by the artifact, so entranced he failed to notice the mist that had crept ever closer along the floorboards as it issued forth from the small wood-burning stove behind him. Ever onward it came, crawling up his back until finally it plunged deep into his brain via his left ear canal. Ezra's brain exploded with 1,000 images of a history, not his own. He saw an endless array of beings, more beast than man, hideous and beautiful in equal measure. He floated onward through a great city beneath the forest floor. Finally, he saw a diaphanous stag, over 20 feet high, its head adorned with 7 sets of antlers. The image swirled and rippled as the sight of that ebony edifice he held filled his field of vision. Ezra felt his arm move of its own accord, and while he struggled to make it remain at rest, he was powerless to stop its ascent or the action which followed. His hand simply placed the glowing midnight-hued object into his mouth, which had mechanically opened to accept it. For the briefest of seconds he could taste infinity, and with that he could feel a new organ grow inside him, a tongue, which pulsed and throbbed within his mouth. His first words were a scream. Then came blackness. "You murdered the historian. You must take his place." The voice echoed so loud in his mind that it snapped him awake. Ezra found himself lying on the cold floor of his cabin. "Historian?" he said involuntarily. His eyes grew wide as the memory of the dark tongue which had replaced his own missing organ flowed into his head. With a start, he lifted himself from the floor and sped to the bathroom. Examining himself in the mirror, he opened his mouth to view that demon tissue, which he seemed to know by some arcane intuition was connected to that ancient stag. There sat the obsidian, stone-like mass of the previous night, but now it pulsed and throbbed with an unearthly power which flowed through those golden veins which now had spread throughout the interior of his mouth. Ezra began clawing at the offending member, but to no avail. The flesh, though supple, was completely unyielding. His thoughts locked upon its removal. Ezra ran to the kitchen to procure a large steak knife. As he steeled his nerves, Ezra stuck out his tongue and brought the blade into place for the amputation. The air split with static before he could begin that dreaded surgery. The small shortwave radio, his one mechanical distraction which provided for him a chance to voyeuristically listen to the voices of others, without being pressed to respond in kind, had come to life from its home atop his rough-hewn dining room table. As he dashed into the room, his eyes beheld yet another incomprehensible sight. The mist now solidified into the contours of a vaguely humanoid shape, save for the long horns protruding from its incorporeal forehead. It hunched over the device and exhaled streams of vapor directly into the microphone. From somewhere, that sounded both close and at the opposite end of the galaxy, came a sound that at first was not unlike the purring of a large cat, but quickly turned into a low, guttural growl before finally becoming words that simply could not have been formed by human lips.
"Pass on, old friend. We are coming."
Ezra reached for the figure, which dissipated into the ether at his touch, accompanied by a chorus of melodic laughter. He grabbed for the microphone in one hand, and with the other tried furiously to find the proper channel to connect him with the one agency he felt would be able to help him fend off whatever malevolence was creeping his way: the town militia of Jaden's Cross. Finally, he arrived at the proper frequency, and parted his dry lips to do that which had eluded him, these many years. Pressing the button which would allow his voice to travel the waves, Ezra began to speak. What followed was not one voice, but legion. Some were mere growls, others came like gently chirping birds, and a few were close to human, yet still possessing a preternatural timbre. But above all rang the impossibly deep tones of their god. For the stag did speak, the great animal whose voice was known when the universe was a mere speck of dust hanging like a mote in the eye of infinity. With that, the radio exploded in a shower of acrid smoke and sparks that knocked Ezra to the floor. Ezra began to weep, yet the sound of crying that issued from his mouth was again the product of that unholy throng. Unable to retain his tenuous grasp on sanity, he was determined to rip the organ from his mouth with his bare hands, hands that he noticed were covered in runes and glyphs carved deep upon the surface of his skin. Furiously he flew again to the bathroom, where he exhaled in shock at the face that met his gaze within the mirror. Like his hands and every other scrap of visible flesh, he was covered in those strange markings. Ezra clawed at the skin, which gave way in thin sheets to reveal layers of fresh dermis below marked the same as the skin above. He attempted to scream, but what came instead was the shouting of every supernatural being that had ever or will ever walk the earth, all proclaiming their name to the midnight that lie just beyond the cabin's roof. Ezra ran towards the door of the cabin, the ancient instinct to flee that which we do not, or simply cannot understand, overtaking him. But suddenly, he could move forward no more, as that demon mist once more held him firm where it issued from between the floorboards of the cabin to solidify into its humanoid form, the shifting arms of which wrapped tightly around its panic-stricken prey.
"You murdered me,"
it whispered seductively.
"Now you shall walk eternally into that resplendent ebony with your brethren."
Ezra struggled for a moment until a sound, distant at first yet growing ever nearer, began to fill the room. The pounding of hooves upon cold ground. The front door exploded in a maelstrom of splinters as a menagerie appeared that was equal parts animal and man, and the worst of both, Ezra once again succumbed to the ebon darkness. Over the next hours, Ezra would occasionally regain consciousness, and while the moonlight illuminated only endless miles of forest, it also revealed the talon-tipped hands that held him aloft, as well as the nightmares they belonged to. Finally he came to. The group had stopped before a long-forgotten farmhouse. Even in the waning moonlight, the house looked impossibly ancient and beyond any hope of repair. One of the creatures to his left loped forward and threw open the large storm doors, whose hinges creaked and protested and led Ezra down into the darkness. They walked for what seemed several minutes through the inky blackness. Occasionally, Ezra could swear that he felt hot breath on the back of his neck, or a gentle touch of something inhuman reaching toward him from the darkness. Soon in the distance a faint light could be seen, which grew brighter and brighter, until Ezra could make out the lithe silhouette of his guide. They arrived in a large circular room which was carved from the earth itself. A multitude of doorways dotted the walls, and in the darkness of each, Ezra could see indescribable shapes moving ever closer in the light. Finally, all were revealed as creatures which may have been constructed of wild daydreams, absinthe visions, and children's chalk drawings gathered in the chamber. Ezra shrunk under their gaze, for here, as in the world above, he felt the outsider.
Say hello to your new family.
Something croaked from the assemblage. A being, more owl than man, stepped from the crowd and stared at Ezra for what seemed like days. As it looked, it would crane its head from side to side and snap its great beak open and shut. Ezra stood, stock still. Suddenly, it dawned on him that the beast wasn't figuring out the best way to pluck out his eyes. Rather, it was reading the glyphs that adorned his face. He gasped as the owl spoke.
You tell the story of my family?
Ezra could only stare at the being, dumbfounded.
No,
came a voice from the throng.
He tells the tale of the Fleet Claws. I can read it even from here. And the Moon Wraiths,
came a response from the crowd.
No, he tells the story of us all. Look!
Ezra looked down at his hands, which had started to unravel into long flesh scrolls which were soon picked up by the discolored fingers, talons, and tentacles, the owners of which read aloud and babbled excitedly of the stories contained therein, of their sacred lineage, as well as their futures. Soon Ezra was unraveling from every piece of exposed skin, some of which drifted to the ground as torn pages from an ancient tome. More creatures arrived and picked up the pages, laughing as they celebrated all that made them. Onward and onward the pages and scrolls fell, until finally all that was left of Ezra were the pages themselves. Each tribesman held a page or scroll of their own, and each cherished the sacred words they contained.
The stranger came to speak to us all, and what words he has brought us.
So I don't know, maybe having no tongue at all was better than becoming a sort of oral tradition, although, the runes are, I guess, the printed word, but I like that one quite a bit, and I want to thank our very talented and enduring producer for writing that story, Dan Wilder. Dan is a integral part of the show. Oftentimes you don't, know much about him other than you hear me talk about him, but without Dan, there would be no Weekly Spooky because he really helps me do some of the heavy lifting. And sometimes there's a lot of heavy lifting, and it's not always corpses that we're lifting, but oftentimes it is. But I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope everybody listening to this is safe and well. I am doing the best I can. I don't take long isolation very well. I don't think many people do. But I am keeping myself entertained. I am checking on my loved ones, and I hope you all are too. And I hope that this podcast is giving you a little respite. It's giving you a little 20 minutes once a week that lets you chill out and feel a little scared. Get you ready for October, because hopefully this whole mess will be blown over well before October. But, anyway, I don't want to get positive or negative. I just want to say that I wish you all well, and I hope you are doing very well. And I want to take a second to thank our Patreon backers, our podcast boosters on Patreon, Kevin Fry, Jack Kerr, Karen Ouimet, Craig Cohen, and Rob Fields. Thank you guys so much for keeping us going. Really do appreciate it. And if you want to get on Patreon and support us, it's hugely appreciated, but I know a lot of people are not having great times financially. So, also just share the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, go to weeklyspooky.com. You can find all kinds of stuff. This is our 25th episode. We have over 6 months of spookies for you guys. So until next time, I'm going to get out of here. I'll talk to you next Wednesday. You take care, be scared, and I'll talk at you later.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.